Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, you'll find various videos produced in an effort to defend historic Christianity from alternative viewpoints that skeptics and others bring. I hope you'll find value in my work in the video that you're about to watch. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to receiving your feedback. Currently, I'm going through the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. These are the contents of that book. If you have found value in my work, there is a published work out there written by me. It is a commentary volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. The title is Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. It's available where books are sold, and the publisher is Zulon Press. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we're looking at Chapter 12 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The title is, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead? So what do scholars say about the resurrection? Gary Habermas has completed the most comprehensive investigation to date on what scholars believe about the resurrection. Habermas collected more than 1,400 of the most critical scholarly works on the resurrection from the years 1975 to 2003. In his book, The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, Gary Habermas reports that virtually all scholars from across the ideological spectrum, from ultra-liberals to Bible-thumping conservatives, agree that the following points concerning Jesus and Christianity are actual historical facts. In other words, these facts are agreed upon by the religious and the irreligious. Fact number 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Fact number 2, Jesus was buried, most likely in a private tomb. Number 3, soon afterwards, Jesus' disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. Number 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. Number 5, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. Due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. Fact number 7. The proclamation of the resurrection took place very early from the beginning of church history. Fact number 8. The disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. Fact number 9. The gospel message centered on the preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 10. Sunday was a primary day for gathering and worshiping. Fact number 11. James, Jesus' half-brother and skeptic before this time, was converted when he believed that he saw the risen Jesus. And fact number 12. Just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, otherwise known as Paul, became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So the acceptance of these 12 facts makes sense in light of what we've seen so far. The evidence discussed in previous chapters of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, that evidence shows that the New Testament story is not a legend. The New Testament documents were written well within 2 generations of the events by eyewitnesses or their contemporaries, and the New Testament storyline is corroborated by non-Christian writers. In addition, the New Testament mentions at least 30 historical figures who've been confirmed by sources outside the New Testament. Therefore, the New Testament story cannot be a legend. In addition to not being a legend, the New Testament story is also not a lie. The New Testament writers included divergent and embarrassing details, difficult and demanding sayings, and they carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own words. They also referenced facts and eyewitnesses that their readers either already knew or could verify. In fact, the New Testament writers provoked their readers and prominent first-century enemies to check out what they said. If that's not enough to confirm their truthfulness, then their martyrdom should remove any doubt. These eyewitnesses endured persecution and death for the empirical claim that they had seen, heard, and touched the risen Jesus. Yet they could have saved themselves by simply denying their testimony. In addition, the New Testament story is not an embellishment. In addition to not being a legend or a lie, it's also not an embellishment. The New Testament writers were meticulously accurate, as evidenced by well over 140 historically confirmed details. They recorded miracles in those same historically confirmed narratives, and they did so without apparent embellishment or significant theological comment. So, is the New Testament true? If most scholars agree with the 12 facts stated above, because the evidence shows that the New Testament story is not a legend, a lie, or an embellishment, then we know beyond a reasonable doubt that the New Testament writers accurately recorded what they saw. Does this mean that all the events in the New Testament are true? Not necessarily. The skeptic still has one last out. The last possible out for the skeptic is that the New Testament writers were deceived. In other words, perhaps the New Testament writers simply were wrong about what they thought they saw. Given the characteristics of the New Testament that we've already reviewed, it does not seem plausible that the New Testament writers were deceived about everyday non-miraculous events. They've been proven right about so many historical details. Why doubt their observations about everyday events? But were they deceived about miraculous events such as the resurrection? Perhaps they really believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that's why they paid with their lives, not because they were mistaken or fooled. Perhaps there are natural explanations for all the miracles they think they saw. Critical scholars leave themselves this out. Consider fact number 5 from the dozen facts that nearly all scholars believe. Fact number 5, again, is that the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. In other words, scholars are not necessarily saying that Jesus actually rose from the dead, although some think that he did. The minimal consensus of nearly all scholars is that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. For all the eyewitnesses and contemporaries of the events to be wrong, there must be some other explanation for the resurrection and the other miracles recorded in the New Testament. Since the resurrection is the central event in Christianity, let's begin there. How do skeptics explain away the resurrection? We're going to see some skepticism about some skeptical theories. First, we're going to look at the hallucination theory. Were the disciples deceived by hallucinations? Perhaps they sincerely thought they had seen the risen Jesus, but instead were really experiencing hallucinations. This theory has a number of fatal flaws. We'll address 2 of them. First, hallucinations are not experienced by groups, but hallucinations are only experienced by individuals. In that regard, they're a lot like dreams. That's why if a friend says to you one morning, "Wow, that was a great dream we had last night," you don't say to that friend who had the dream, "Yeah, it was fabulous. Should we continue it tonight?" No, you think your friend's gone mad or is just joking around. You can take your friend seriously because dreams are not collective experiences shared by more than one person. Individuals have dreams, groups do not have dreams. Hallucinations work like dreams. If rare psychological conditions exist, an individual may have an hallucination, but that individual that has a hallucination will be the only one having it. His friends will not have the same hallucination. And even if they do, even if his friends do have hallucinations, they will not have the same hallucination. The hallucination theory doesn't work because Jesus didn't appear once to just one person. He appeared on a dozen separate occasions in a variety of settings to different people over a 40-day period. He was seen by men and women. He was seen walking, talking, and eating. He was seen inside. He was seen outside. He was seen by many. He was seen by few. A total of more than 500 people saw this risen Jesus. And they were not seeing an hallucination or a ghost because on 6 of the 12 appearances, Jesus was physically touched or he ate real food. You can pause this video and you can look at the order of the 12 appearances of Christ. This is a picture taken from inside the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Feel free to pause the video at this time to review this table. The existence of the empty tomb is the second fatal flaw with the hallucination theory. If the 500-plus eyewitnesses did have the unprecedented experience of seeing the same hallucination at 12 different times, then why didn't the Jewish or Roman authorities simply parade Jesus' body around the city? That would have ended Christianity once and forever. That they would have loved to do so, but apparently they couldn't because the tomb really was empty. So first, we're going to discuss how the witnesses went to the wrong tomb. Maybe the disciples went to the wrong tomb and then assumed that Jesus had risen because they didn't go to the right tomb. This theory also has 2 fatal flaws. First, if the disciples had gone to the wrong tomb, the Jewish or Roman authorities would have gone to the right tomb and paraded Jesus' body around the city. The tomb was known to the Jews because it was their tomb. It belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. and the tomb was known by the Romans because they placed guards there. As William Lane Craig notes, the wrong tomb theory assumes that all of the Jews and the Romans had a permanent kind of collective amnesia about what they had done with the body of Jesus. Second, even if the disciples did go to the wrong tomb, the theory does not explain how the risen Jesus appeared to 12 different times. Does not explain how the risen Jesus appeared 12 different times. In other words, the appearances must be explained, not just the empty tomb. Notice that the empty tomb did not convince most of the disciples, with the possible exception of John, that Jesus had risen from the dead. It was the appearances of Jesus that turned them from scared, scattered, skeptical cowards into the greatest peaceful missionary force in history. This is especially true of the devout enemy of Christianity, Saul, who later became known as the Apostle Paul. He was not only unconvinced by the empty tomb, he was persecuting Christians very soon after the resurrection. It took an appearance of Jesus himself to turn Paul around. It seems that James, the skeptical half-brother of Jesus, was converted after an appearance of Jesus. As we've seen, James's conversion was so dramatic that he became the leader of the Jerusalem church and was later martyred at the hands of the high priest. The bottom line is this: even if one could explain the empty tomb naturally, this would not be enough to disprove the resurrection. An alternative theory of the resurrection must also explain away Jesus' appearances after his resurrection. The wrong tomb theory explains neither the resurrection or the appearances. Next, we're going to look at the swoon or the apparent death theory, which says that Christ didn't die, that he only fainted. Is it possible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross? Perhaps merely Jesus swooned or fainted. In other words, he was still alive when he was placed in the tomb, but he somehow escaped his disciples. He escaped, and his disciples thought that he had risen from the dead. But there are numerous fatal flaws with this theory as well. First, enemies and friends alike believed Jesus was dead. The Romans, who were professional executioners, whipped and beat Jesus to the point of his collapse. Then they drove heavy, wrought iron nails through his wrists and feet and plunged a spear into his side. They didn't break his legs to speed death because they knew he was already dead. Crucifixion victims often died by asphyxiation because they couldn't push themselves up to breathe. Breaking the legs would therefore speed death. Moreover, Pilate checked to make sure that Jesus was dead, and Jesus' death was the reason the disciples had lost all hope. The brutal Roman crucifixion techniques have been verified through archaeology and non-Christian written sources. Chapter 15 from this book contains a vivid description of Jesus' crucifixion experience. In 1968, the remains of a first-century crucifixion victim were found in a Jerusalem cave. The heel bone of this man had a 7-inch nail driven through it, and his lower arms showed evidence of nails as well. The spear in the heart has also been verified as a Roman crucifixion technique by the Roman author Quintilian. Given such treatment of Jesus, it's no wonder the eyewitnesses thought Jesus was dead. Not only did those in the first century believe Jesus was dead, modern medical doctors also believed Jesus actually died. Writing in the March 21st, 1986 edition of the Journal of the Medical Association, 3 medical doctors, including a pathologist from the Mayo Clinic, concluded, quote, "Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear thrust between his right rib probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, and thereby ensured his death." Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. As we indicated in the last chapter, the blood and water from the spear wound appears to be another genuine eyewitness detail from the pen of John. That fact alone should end all doubt about the death of Jesus. A second major flaw in the swoon theory is that Jesus was embalmed in 75 pounds of bandages and spices. It's highly unlikely that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus would have mistakenly embalmed a living Jesus. Third, even if everyone was wrong about Jesus being dead when he went to the tomb, how could a badly injured and bleeding man still be alive 36 hours later? He would have bled to death in that cold, damp, dark tomb. Fourth, even if he did survive the cold, damp, dark tomb, how could he unwrap himself, move the 2-ton rock up and away from inside the tomb, and get by the elite Roman guards who would be killed for allowing the breach of security, and then convince the scared, scattered, skeptical, coward disciples that he'd triumphed over death? Even if Jesus could get out of the tomb and past the Roman guards, Jesus would have been a battered, bleeding pulp of a man whom the disciples would pity and not worship. They'd say, you may be alive, but you're certainly not risen. Let's get you to a doctor. Fifth, the swoon theory cannot explain Jesus' bright light appearance to Paul on the Damascus Road. What turned around this avowed enemy of Christianity shortly after the crucifixion? It certainly wasn't a normal human being who had healed from his crucifixion experience. Paul's description of his conversion is recorded twice in the historically authenticated book of Acts. Verse 6, 7, and 8 in chapter 22. Paul tells a hostile Jewish crowd about Jesus' appearance to him when he says that he came near Damascus and a great light from heaven shone around him and he fell to the ground, and the voice said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Paul immediately says, who are you, Lord? Because he knows it's the Lord. And the Lord identifies himself and says, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. Paul was then blindfolded for 3 days and experienced a 180-degree attitude change. He went from Christianity's most eager enemy to Christianity's most ardent advocate. Paul's conversion experience cannot be explained by a swooned Jesus wielding a torch using his God voice from the bushes. This was a dramatic display of divine power in broad daylight that dramatically changed Paul and the world forever. Sixth, several non-Christian writers affirmed that Jesus had died by crucifixion. These non-Christian writers that affirmed that Jesus died by crucifixion include Josephus, Tacitus, Thallus, and the Jewish Talmud. The Jewish Talmud, for example, says that Yeshua, who is Jesus, was hung on a tree on the eve of the Passover. This is not a source, the Talmud is not a source that's considered friendly to Christianity, so there's no reason to doubt the Talmud's authenticity. For these reasons and others, very few scholars believe the swoon theory anymore. There's simply too much evidence against the swoon theory to believe it. Next, we're going to look at the theft theory, which makes the assertion that the disciples stole Jesus' body. The theory that the disciples stole Jesus' body cannot support the skeptics' last option, that the New Testament writers were all deceived. Why? Because the theory makes the New Testament writers the deceivers, not the deceived ones. This, of course, flies in the face of all the evidence that we've seen so far. The theory takes an untenable position that the New Testament writers were all liars. For some inexplicable reason, they stole the body in order to get themselves beaten, tortured, and martyred. But that's sink in. That the New Testament writers stole Jesus' body so that they could be beaten, tortured, and martyred. That doesn't make logical sense. Adherents to this theory can't explain why anyone would do this. Why would the disciples embark on such a self-defeating conspiracy? Not to mention, why would they as we've said elsewhere, why would they willingly die for a lie? Which, if they stole the body, they would be perpetuating a known lie that Jesus had risen from the dead. So why would they do this and then go to their graves preaching this message, knowing that while they were preaching it, they knew that it was a lie? Why would they go to such trouble? That makes no logical sense. But anyway, why would the disciples embark on such a self-defeating conspiracy? And why did every one of them continue to say that Jesus had risen from the dead when they could have saved themselves from martyrdom by recanting their testimony? Exactly. In addition to the disciples' severe conflict of interest, adherents of this theory cannot explain other absurdities required by their theory. For example, how did the disciples get past the elite Roman guards who were trained to guard the tomb with their lives? If Jesus never rose from the dead, then who was it that appeared to Paul, James, and the other eyewitnesses? Did the New Testament writers lie about their conversions too? Did Paul simply make up the evidence found in 1 Corinthians? What about the non-Christian writers? Did Josephus lie about James being martyred by the Sanhedrin? Did the Roman writer Pelagian, who was born around AD 80, lie as well when he wrote in his chronicles that Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands and feet had been pierced by nails? It would take more of a miracle for all this to happen than for Jesus to rise from the dead. We don't have enough faith to believe that. As we've seen, the notion that the disciples stole the body is exactly the explanation that the Jews offered to explain away the empty tomb. Beyond the fact that the disciples had not motive or ability to steal the body, this ancient Jewish explanation was not a good lie for two other reasons. Number one, the first reason for why this Jewish explanation was not a good lie was, how would the sleeping guards have known the disciples stole the body? And, number 2, no Roman guard would admit to the capital crime of sleeping on the job. Perhaps that's why, as Matthew records, the Jewish authorities had to pay off the guards and promise to keep them out of trouble with the governor. In the year 1878, a fascinating archaeological discovery was made that may corroborate the Bible's claim that the Jews were circulating the theft explanation. A marble slab measuring 15 by 24 inches was discovered in Nazareth with this inscription, quote, "Ordinance of Caesar. It is my pleasure that graves and tombs remain perpetually undisturbed for those who've made them for their cult or their ancestors or children or members of their house. If, however, anyone charges that another has demolished them or has in any other way extracted the buried or has maliciously transferred them to other places in order to wrong them or has displaced the ceiling on other stones, against such a one I order that a trial be instituted as in respect of the gods, so in regard to the cult of mortals. For it shall be much more obligatory to honor the buried. Let it be absolutely forbidden for anyone to disturb them. In case of violation, I desire that the offender be sentenced to capital punishment on charge of violation of the sepulchre." End quote. Scholars believe this edict was issued by Emperor Tiberius, who reigned from AD 14 to AD 37, which happened to be during the time of most of Christ's life, or Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 AD. The striking nature of this edict, that it raises the penalty for grave robbing from a mere fine to death. Why would the Roman emperor bother to make such a severe edict this time in such a remote area of his empire? While no one knows for sure the reason for the edict, there are a couple of likely possibilities, both of which point back to Jesus. If the inscription is from Tiberius, then it's likely that Tiberius learned of Jesus through one of Pilate's annual reports to him. Justin Martyr claims that this was the case. Included in that report may have been the Jewish explanation for the empty tomb, that the disciples stole the body, prompting Tiberius to prevent any future resurrections with the edict. If the inscription is from Claudius, then the edict may have been part of his response to the riots in Rome in AD 49. In Acts chapter 18, verse 2, Luke mentions that Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. This is confirmed by the Roman historian Suetonius, who tells us that because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius, expelled them from the city. Chrestus, I believe, is Christ, yeah. What did Christ have to do with Jewish riots from Rome? Perhaps Rome experienced the same course of events that took place in Thessalonica at roughly the same time. In Acts chapter 17, Luke records that Thessalonica was thrown into turmoil when the Jews became jealous of Paul preaching that Jesus had risen from the dead. These Jews complained to the city officials, quote, "These men," referring to Paul and Luke, "who've caused trouble all over the world, have now come here. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there's another king, one called Jesus." That's in Acts 17, verses 6 and 7. If this is actually what happened in Rome, then Claudius would not have been pleased with a group who was defying his decrees and following another king. Once Claudius had learned that this now seditious act originated with the Jews who believed their leader had resurrected, Claudius may have exiled all the Jews from Rome and made grave robbing a capital offense. Either of these two possibilities would explain the timing, location, and severity of the edict. But even if the edict is not connected with Christ's empty tomb, we already have good evidence that the Jews put forth the theft hypothesis, as the last chapter discussed. The main point is that the theft hypothesis was a tacit admission that the tomb was really empty. After all, why would the Jews concoct an explanation for the empty tomb if Jesus' body was still in the tomb? The next skeptical explanation for the resurrection is that a substitute took Jesus' place on the cross. This happens to be the explanation that's offered by many Muslims today, that Jesus was not crucified, but that someone like Judas was killed in Jesus' place. The Quran claims of Jesus, quote, in Surah 4, verses 157 and 158, "They killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them, and those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For of a surety they killed him not, Nay, Allah raised him up unto himself, and Allah is exalted in power wise. That's Surah 4, 157 and 158, end quote. So according to the Quran, it only appeared that Jesus was crucified, and Allah took him directly to heaven. There are a number of problems with this theory, that a substitute took Jesus' place on the cross, not the least being that there's absolutely no evidence to back this theory up. The assertion from the Quran comes more than 600 years after the lifetime of Jesus, yet the events of the Gospels are within 100 years, well under 100 years. How can this be considered a more authoritative source for the life of Jesus than the accounts of the eyewitnesses that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? For if this theory contradicts all the eyewitness testimony and the testimony of non-Christian sources, this theory that a substitute took Jesus' place on the cross contradicts all the eyewitness testimony and the testimony of non-Christian sources. Moreover, this theory raises more questions than it answers. Are we to believe that scores of people who witnessed some aspect of Jesus' death, the disciples, the Roman guards, Pilate, the Jews, Jesus' family, and friends, were all mistaken about who was killed? How could so many people be wrong about a simple identification? This is like saying that Abraham Lincoln wasn't the one killed next to his wife on that April evening in 1865 at Ford's Theater. Was Mary Lincoln mistaken about the man sitting next to her? Was Lincoln's bodyguard wrong about whom he was guarding? Was everyone else mistaken about the identity of the president as well? This is not believable. There are many other questions raised by the theory that a substitute took Jesus' place on the cross. If Jesus wasn't killed, then why was the tomb of the man who really was killed found empty? Are we to believe that the substitute rose from the dead? If so, how did the substitute rise from the dead? Are we to believe that all non-Christian historians are wrong about Jesus' death? And what are we to make about the Jewish admission of Jesus' death? Was the Talmud mistaken for saying that Jesus was hanged on a tree on the eve of Passover? In short, are we to believe that everyone from the first century was wrong about everything? One has to question a theory that comes more than 600 years after the events and asks you to believe that all the first century evidence is wrong. In fact, this theory contradicts most of the 12 facts virtually all scholars believe that we recounted in the beginning of this chapter. Like other alternative theories, this one is built on mere speculation without a shred of evidence to support it. Therefore, we don't have enough faith to believe it. The next skeptical theory, the next theory that skeptics raise for an alternative to the resurrection is that the disciples' faith led to their belief in the resurrection. John Dominic Crossan is co-founder of the far-left group of scholars and critics who call themselves the Jesus Seminar. They've decided that only 18% of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels are authentic. For more on them, see Appendix 3 in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. They don't give any real evidence for this skepticism. John Dominic Crossan and those from the Jesus Seminar don't give any real evidence for this skepticism. They just give speculative theories about how the faith of the disciples led to their belief in the resurrection and just about everything else in the New Testament. This theory was brought out well during a debate that Crossan had with William Lane Craig over the resurrection. Crossan offered the theory that the disciples made up the resurrection story because they searched the scriptures after his death and found that persecution, if not execution, was almost like a job description of being God's elect. The entire 2-hour debate between Crossan and William Lane Craig turned on Craig's response. He said, right. William Lane Craig said to Dominic Crossan, right. And that came after they experienced the resurrection appearances. The faith of the disciples did not lead to the resurrection appearances, but it was the appearances which led to their faith. They searched the scriptures, end quote. Indeed, the scared, scattered, skeptical disciples were not of the mind to invent a resurrection story and then go out and die for it. They were of the mind to go hide for fear of the Jews. It was the resurrection appearances that gave the disciples the bold faith that they had. It was not their bold faith that helped them believe in a resurrection. Crossan has it backwards. In addition to the fact that there's no evidence for Crossan's theory, Crossan cannot explain for the resurrection appearances to more than 500 people, nor can he account for the empty tomb or the Jewish attempt to explain it, that the disciples stole the body. The Jews knew the disciples were claiming that the resurrection was a real historical event, not a mere product of their faith. It's as if, as Crossan says, the resurrection didn't really occur, then why did the Jewish authorities, right through the 2nd century, continue to insist the disciples had stolen the body? Crossan has no answer for this because his theory is false. You have to have a lot of faith and overlook a lot of evidence to believe it. The next alternative explanation to the resurrection is that the New Testament writers copied pagan resurrection myths. This theory asserts that the New Testament is not historical because New Testament writers merely copied pagan resurrection myths. Skeptics are quick to cite supposed resurrections of mythical characters like Marduk, Adonis, and Osiris. So, like Marduk, Adonis, and Osiris, is the New Testament just another myth? Could this theory be true? That's not likely for a number of reasons. First, as we've seen, the New Testament's anything but mythological. Unlike many pagan myths, the New Testament's loaded with eyewitness evidence and real historical figures, and it is corroborated by several outside sources. C.S. Lewis, a writer of myths himself, has commented that the New Testament stories do not show signs of being mythological. All I am in private life, Lewis says, quote, all I am in private life is a literary critic and historian. That's my job, Lewis said. And I'm prepared to say on that basis, if anyone thinks the Gospels are either legends or novels, then that person's simply showing his incompetence as a literary critic. I read a great many novels, and I know a fair amount about the legends that grew up among early people, and I know perfectly well the Gospels are not that kind of stuff, end quote. The Gospels are not legends. Second, pagan myth theory cannot explain the empty tomb, the martyrdom of the eyewitnesses, or the testimony of the non-Christian writings. Nor can a pagan myth explain the evidence that leads nearly all scholars to accept the other historical facts that we listed at the beginning of this chapter. Third, ancient non-Christian sources knew that the New Testament writers were not offering mythical accounts. As Craig Blomberg observes, quote, the earliest Jewish and pagan critics of the resurrection understood the gospel writers to be making historical claims, not writing myth or legend. They merely disputed the plausibility of those claims, end quote. Fourth, no Greek or Roman myth spoke of the literal incarnation of a monotheistic God into human form by way of a literal virgin birth, followed by his death and physical resurrection. The Greeks were polytheists, not monotheists, as New Testament Christians were. Moreover, the Greeks believed in reincarnation into a different mortal body. New Testament Christians believed in resurrection into the same physical body made immortal. Fifth, the first real parallel of a dying and rising God does not appear until AD 150, more than 100 years after the origin of Christianity. So, if there was any influence of one on the other, it was the influence of the historical event of the New Testament on mythology, not the reverse. Let me say that again. If there was any influence of one on the other, it was the influence of the historical event of the New Testament on mythology, not the reverse. The only known account of a god surviving death that predates Christianity is the Egyptian cult Osiris. In this myth, Osiris is cut into 14 pieces, scattered around Egypt, then reassembled and brought back to life by the goddess Isis. However, Osiris does not actually come back to physical life, but becomes a member of a shadowy underworld. As Gary Habermas and Michael Licona observe, this is far different than Jesus' resurrection account, where he was the gloriously risen Prince of Life who was seen by others on earth before his ascension to heaven, end quote. Finally, if there are myths about dying and rising gods prior to Christianity, that doesn't mean the New Testament writers copied from them. The fictional TV show Star Trek preceded the U.S. Space Shuttle program, but that doesn't mean the newspaper reports of space shuttle missions are influenced by Star Trek episodes. One has to look at the evidence of each account to see whether it's historical or mythical. There's no eyewitness or corroborating evidence for the historicity of Osiris' resurrection or for that of any other pagan god. No one believes they are true historical figures. But as we've seen, there's strong eyewitness and corroborating evidence to support the historicity of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But do you have any evidence for that? Christians are used to counterpunching alternative theories to the resurrection. In fact, we've just done that by pointing out the numerous deficiencies in the alternative theories ourselves. But that's not enough. While skeptics rightfully put the burden of proof for the resurrection on Christians, and as we've seen, Christians can meet that burden with good evidence, Christians need to put the burden of proof on skeptics for their alternative theories. In light of all the positive evidence for the resurrection, skeptics must offer positive first-century evidence for the alternative views. It's one thing to concoct an alternative theory to the resurrection, but it's another thing to actually find first-century evidence for it. A theory is not evidence. Reasonable people demand evidence, not just theories. Anyone can concoct a theory to explain any historical event. For example, If someone were to claim that all of the video footage from the Holocaust concentration camps was staged and manufactured by Jews in order to garner sympathy and support for a Jewish state, would you believe that theory? Of course not, because that theory flies in the face of all the known evidence. To be taken seriously, those who offer such a theory must present credible, independent eyewitness reports and other corroborating evidence to counter the numerous reports that say the Holocaust was real and was actually carried out by the Nazis, but no such counter evidence exists. This is the case with the resurrection. While skeptics have formulated numerous alternative theories to explain away the resurrection, there's no evidence from any first-century source supporting any of the alternative theories to explain away the resurrection. The only alternative theory that's even mentioned in a first-century source, that the disciples stole the body, is from Matthew, and it is clearly identified as a lie. No one from the ancient world, not even the enemies of Christianity, has offered a plausible alternative explanation for the resurrection. Many alternative theories formulated over the past 200 years are rooted in anti-supernaturalism. Since modern scholars philosophically rule out miracles in advance, they concoct ad hoc explanations to explain away the resurrection. As we've seen, their ad hoc explanations contain multiple absurdities or improbabilities. Those who have alternative theories for the resurrection should be asked, what evidence do you have for your theory? Can you please name 3 or 4 first-century sources that support your theory? When honest skeptics are presented with this question, they typically answer with silence or a stuttering admission that they have no such evidence because none exists. And it's not just the resurrection that the skeptics have to explain. They also have to explain the other 35 miracles that eyewitnesses have associated with Jesus. Are we to believe that the 4 gospel writers were all deceived about all those miracles as well as the resurrection? The mass deception theory needs evidence. Do we have any other first-century sources that offer a different explanation for the works of Jesus? The only one discovered, and it's probably from the 2nd century, is the Jewish Talmud, which admits that Jesus performed unusual acts by saying that he practiced sorcery. But this explanation is just as weak as the Jewish explanation for the resurrection, that the disciples stole the body. Perhaps sorcery could explain some of Jesus' miracles, but all 35? Sorcerers and magicians cannot perform the kinds of acts Jesus is said to have performed: raising the dead, giving sight to the blind, walking on water, and so forth. So if there's no ancient evidence for deception, are we to take the New Testament miracles at face value? Why not? We live in a theistic universe where miracles are possible. While it's true that we don't have independent attestation for all the miracles in the New Testament because some are mentioned by only one writer, we certainly have multiple attestation for many of them, including the resurrection. The sheer number of Jesus' miracles cited by independent sources is too great to be explained away as a great deception. One person may be deceived once, but not numerous observers repeatedly. German scholar Wolfgang Trilling writes, "We're convinced and hold it for historically certain that Jesus did in fact perform miracles. The miracle reports occupy so much space in the Gospels that it's impossible that all could have been subsequently invented or transferred to Jesus." End quote, by Wolfgang Trilling. William Lane Craig concludes, quote, "The fact that miracle working belongs to the historical Jesus is no longer disputed." End quote. That is, miracles are not disputed. Miracles are not disputed on historical grounds, only on philosophical grounds. More on this shortly. The bottom line is that there are too many miracles and too much testimony to believe that all the eyewitnesses got it wrong every time. With regard to the resurrection, all alternative theories have fatal flaws, and we have strong eyewitness evidence and circumstantial evidence that Jesus actually rose from the dead. In other words, not only do we lack a supernatural explanation for the empty tomb, we have positive evidence. In other words, not only do we lack a natural explanation for the empty tomb, we have positive evidence for the resurrection. The explanation that requires the least amount of faith is that Jesus really did perform miracles and really did rise from the dead, as Jesus predicted. So we don't have enough faith to believe that the New Testament writers are all deceived. But why don't all scholars believe? If we have an accurate copy of early testimony, like we saw in chapter 9, if that testimony is not only early, but it is from eyewitnesses, like we saw in chapter 10, if those eyewitnesses recorded what they actually saw, as we saw in chapter 11, And if those eyewitnesses were not deceived about what they recorded, as we've seen earlier in this chapter, then why don't all scholars take the New Testament at face value? Well, they don't take the New Testament at face value for the same reason that Darwinists refuse to acknowledge the evidence that defeats their worldview. They have a philosophical bias against miracles. The people who reject this stuff have a philosophical bias against miracles because miracles demand the supernatural. The bias was admitted during a debate between William Lane Craig and Dominic Crossan. William Lane Craig believes, as we do, that the evidence for the historicity of the literal resurrection is strong. The evidence for the historicity of the literal resurrection is strong. Crossan, on the other hand, the skeptic, does not believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead. Here's a very telling exchange between Craig and Crossan. Craig says, "Would there be anything, Dr. Crossan, that could convince you that Jesus was risen from the dead as a historical fact?" Crossan responds, "I need to make certain of what we're talking about." Crossan says, "Let's say we have a situation outside the empty tomb on Easter Sunday morning. If someone had a video cam, would we have recorded something coming out of that tomb? Is that the type of question?" Craig says, "I guess what I'm asking, and what I think Mr. Buckley, the moderator, is pushing for is this. What evidence would it take, Mr. Crossan, to convince you? Or are your preconceived ideas about the impossibility of the miraculous and so forth so strong that, in fact, they skew your historical judgment so that such an event could never even be admitted into court?" Crossan says no. A doctor at Lourdes, Crossan says, might admit, I have absolutely no medical way of explaining what has happened. That's a right statement. Then one has the right to say, I, by faith, therefore believe that God has intervened here. I think that was what was meant. If the doctor has no medical explanation for what happened, then Crossan could say that their medical/scientific explanation for what happened. Then Crossan could say, well, then it must be God. But Crossan says it's a theological presupposition of mine that God does not operate that way. Crossan says, what would it take to prove to me what you ask? I don't know unless God changes the universe, Crossan says. I could imagine discovering tomorrow morning that every tree outside my house has moved 5 feet. That needs some explanation. I don't know the explanation, but I won't immediately presume a miracle, Crossan says. Crossan's explicit statement of theological presupposition against miracles is a candid admission on his part. Of course, Crossan doesn't speak for all skeptical scholars, but certainly a majority of skeptical scholars deny the plain reading of the New Testament because they share Crossan's philosophical bias against miracles. It is not that the historical evidence for the New Testament is weak. We have seen that the historical evidence for the New Testament is very strong indeed. But skeptics have ruled out miracles in advance. They arrive at the wrong conclusion because their bias makes it impossible for them to arrive at the right conclusion. Context. Let's take a look at Crossan's final comment about the trees in his yard moving 5 feet overnight. He says he wouldn't immediately presume a miracle. Well, neither would we, because most events actually do have a natural explanation, which incidentally helps miracles stand out when they do occur. The fact that most events actually do have a natural explanation helps miracles stand out when they occur. So it makes perfect sense to look at a natural explanation first. But does that mean that we should never conclude that any event, such as the trees moving, was a miracle? Crossan would not so conclude because of his theological presupposition that God does not work that way. But since that presupposition is unjustified because previous arguments in this chapter make a compelling case that God does in fact exist, what would be the right conclusion? It depends on the context of the event. Recall from the 5th chapter of this book that evidence must be interpreted in light of the context in which it is found. So let's suppose that Crossan's tree moving even occurred in the following context. 200 years in advance, someone claiming to be a prophet of God writes down a prediction that all the trees in one area of Jerusalem would indeed move 5 feet one night during a particular year. 200 years later, a man arrives to tell the townspeople that the tree moving miracle will occur shortly. This man claims to be God, teaches profound truths, and performs many other unusual acts that appear to be miracles. Then one morning, numerous eyewitnesses claimed that the trees in Crossan's Jerusalem yard, including several deep-rooted 100-foot oaks, actually moved 5 feet during the night, just as the God-man predicted. These eyewitnesses also say this is just one of more than 30 miracles performed by the God-man. Then they suffer persecution and martyrdom for proclaiming these miracles and refusing to recant their testimony. Opponents of the God-man don't deny the evidence about the trees or the other miracles, but offer natural explanations that have numerous fatal flaws. Many years later, after all the eyewitnesses are dead, skeptics offer additional natural explanations that prove to be fatally flawed as well. In fact, for the next 1900 years, skeptics try to explain away the event naturally. For the next 1900 years, skeptics tried to explain the event naturally, but no one can. Question: given the context, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that the movement of the trees was supernatural rather than natural in origin? Of course. The context makes all the difference. This is the case we have with the resurrection. It's not just that we lack a natural explanation for the empty tomb, it's that we have positive eyewitness and corroborating circumstantial evidence for the resurrection miracle. Here's the context in which we must evaluate the evidence. Number 1, the theistic nature of the universe makes miracles possible. We live in a theistic universe where miracles are possible. Indeed, the greatest miracle of all, the creation of the universe out of nothing, has already occurred. So God can use the prophets to announce his messages and miracles to confirm them. That is, a miracle can be used to confirm the word of God through a man of God to the people of God. Number 2, we have ancient documents that say miracles are to be expected. We have Old Testament documents written hundreds of years in advance that predict the Messiah, a man who would actually be God, would come, be killed at a specific time as a sacrifice for sinful humanity, and rise from the dead. More on this in the next chapter. Number 3, we have historically confirmed eyewitness documents that say miracles are actual. There are 27 documents written down by 9 eyewitnesses or their contemporaries that describe numerous miraculous events. Many of these documents contain historically confirmed eyewitness testimony that goes back to the time of the events, and the evidence demonstrates that the narrative is not embellished or the product of deception. We know this because the New Testament documents meet all 7 tests of historicity identified in chapter 9. The New Testament documents are early. Most are written 15 to 40 years, well within 2 generations of the events. The New Testament documents contain eyewitness testimony. The New Testament documents contain independent eyewitness testimony from multiple sources. The New Testament documents are written by trustworthy people who taught and lived by the highest standards of ethics and who died for their testimony. The New Testament documents describe events, locations, and individuals corroborated by archaeology and other writers. The New Testament events describe some events that enemies tacitly admit are true, which is called enemy attestation. The New Testament events describe events in details that are embarrassing to the authors and even to Jesus himself. These historically confirmed eyewitness documents tell the following story. At the time and place and in the manner prescribed by the Old Testament, Jesus arrives in Jerusalem and claims to be the Messiah. Jesus teaches profound truths, and according to numerous independent eyewitnesses, performs 35 miracles, some on groups of people, and rises from the dead. Once cowardly and unbelieving eyewitnesses suddenly begin to boldly proclaim Jesus' resurrection in the face of persecution and death. Misguided people may die for a lie they think is true, but they will not die for a lie they know is a lie. New Testament writers were in a position to know the real truth about the resurrection. In the very city of Jesus' death and tomb, a new movement, the church, is born and quickly spreads by peaceful means on the belief that Jesus has risen from the dead. This is difficult to explain if there is no resurrection. If there was no resurrection, how could Christianity begin in a hostile city like Jerusalem if Jesus' body was still in the tomb? The hostile religious and government authorities would have exposed Christianity as fraudulent by exposing the body. All they had to do today, all that has to be done is to produce Jesus' corpse. I mean, if it's a historic fact that he died by crucifixion, and that he was buried in a private tomb, all you got to do is produce the body. But you can't, because the tomb's empty. Otherwise, produce the body. Number 4, thousands of Jerusalem Jews, including Pharisee priests, abandon 5 of their most treasured beliefs and practices and adopt strange new ones after converting to Christianity. Number 5, Saul, the most ardent enemy of the new church, is suddenly converted and becomes its most prolific proponent. He travels the ancient world to proclaim the resurrection, suffering persecution and martyrdom. If there was no resurrection, then why did the greatest enemy of Christianity become its greatest leader? Why did he willingly suffer persecution and death? Number 6, James, the skeptical brother of Jesus, half-brother of Jesus, suddenly becomes convinced that his brother is the Son of God and then becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. James later suffers martyrdom at the hands of the high priest. We all know that family members can be the most difficult people to convince of our religious viewpoint. James began as the unconvinced brother of Jesus in John chapter 7, verse 5. If there was no resurrection, then why did James, who was called the Just by 2nd century historians Clement and Hegesippus, suddenly come to believe that his half-brother, was really the Messiah? Unless he saw the resurrected Christ, why would James become the leader of the Jerusalem church and suffer a martyr's death? Number 7, the Jewish enemies of Christianity don't deny the evidence but offer faulty naturalistic explanations to account for it. Additional confirmation. The collective references of other ancient historians and writers confirm this basic storyline of the New Testament documents, and several archaeological discoveries affirm the details those documents describe. When you put the evidence in proper context, you can see why we don't have enough faith to be skeptical about it. It's a lot more reasonable to be skeptical about skepticism. Skeptics who look at points 2 through 4 above, including the subpoints, may conclude that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But if they do, skeptics have got to provide evidence for an alternative theory that can account for all of these points. As we've seen, they failed and failed miserably. The resurrection best explains all of the evidence. Since there's a God who can act, there can be acts of God. When God's intervention is announced in advance, and you have good eyewitness testimony and corroborating evidence that such events actually occurred, it takes a lot more faith to deny those events. It takes a lot more faith to deny those events than to believe those events. Now we're going to look at extraordinary claims and self-canceling evidence. There are 2 more objections that skeptics often bring up against the resurrection and against miracles. The first one is a demand for extraordinary evidence. Some skeptics might admit that the resurrection is possible, but they say that it would require extraordinary evidence to believe it. Maybe there's a quote in this presentation. There's a relatively famous 21st century skeptic who says something to the effect of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That is, since the New Testament makes extraordinary claims, such as miracles, we must have extraordinary evidence in order to believe those claims. This objection seems reasonable until you ask, what does extraordinary mean? If extraordinary means beyond the natural, then the skeptic is asking the resurrection to be confirmed by another miracle. How could that work? In order to believe in the first miracle, the resurrection, the skeptic would then need a second miracle to support it. He would then demand a third miracle to support the second, a fourth miracle to support the third, a fifth miracle to support the fourth, and this would go on to infinity. So by this criteria, the skeptic would never believe in the resurrection, even if it really did happen. There's something wrong with the standard of proof that makes it impossible for you to believe what's actually occurred. If extraordinary means repeatable as in a laboratory, then no event in history can be believed, because historical events cannot be repeated. The believability of historical events can only be confirmed by looking at the quality of the eyewitness evidence and the nature of the forensic evidence in light of the principles of uniformity and causality. And we covered those principles in the 5th chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Besides, atheists who demand repeatability for biblical miracles are inconsistent because they do not demand repeatability for historical miracles in which they believe, such as the Big Bang. They don't demand that be repeated. They don't demand that the spontaneous generation of first life be repeated. They don't demand that macroevolution of subsequent life forms be repeated. If extraordinary means more than usual, then that's exactly what we have to support the resurrection. We have more eyewitness documents and earlier eyewitness documents for the resurrection than for anything else in the ancient world. And as we've just reviewed, we also have more than usual circumstantial evidence supporting the resurrection. Finally, the skeptic's presupposition can be challenged. We don't need extraordinary evidence to believe something. Atheists affirm this from their own worldview. They believe in the Big Bang not because they have extraordinary evidence for the Big Bang, but because there is enough evidence that the universe exploded into being out of nothing. Good evidence. There is good evidence that the universe exploded into being out of nothing. Good evidence is all you need to believe something. That must have meant to say good evidence. Atheists believe the Big Bang not because they have extraordinary evidence for it, but because there's good evidence that the universe exploded into being out of nothing. And good evidence is all you need to believe something. However, atheists don't even have good evidence for some of their own precious beliefs. For example, atheists believe in spontaneous generation and macroevolution on faith alone. We say faith alone because, as we saw in chapters 5 and 6, there's not only little or no evidence for spontaneous generation and macroevolution, but there's strong evidence against spontaneous generation and macroevolution. Furthermore, skeptics don't demand extraordinary evidence for other extraordinary events from history. For example, few events from ancient history are more extraordinary than the accomplishments of Alexander the Great. Despite living only 33 short years, Alexander the Great achieved unparalleled success between 356 and 323 BC. Alexander the Great conquered much of the civilized world at that time, from Greece east to India and south to Egypt. Yet how do we know this about Alexander? We have no sources from Alexander's lifetime or soon after Alexander's death. We have only fragments of 2 works from about 100 years after his death. The truth is, we base virtually everything we know about the extraordinary life of Alexander the Great from historians who wrote 300 to 500 years after the death of Alexander the Great. In light of the robust evidence for the life of Christ, anyone who doubts Christ's historicity should also doubt the historicity of Alexander the Great. In fact, to be consistent, such a skeptic would have to doubt all of ancient history. Why do skeptics demand extraordinary evidence for the life of Christ, but not the life of Alexander? Because they're hung up on miracles again. That makes sense. Despite the fact that miracles are possible because God exists, and despite the fact that miracles were predicted and then witnessed, skeptics can't bear to admit that miracles have actually occurred. So they set the bar for believability too high. It's as if some skeptics are saying, I won't believe in miracles because I haven't seen one. If the resurrected Jesus were to appear to me, then I would believe in him. Now that would be extraordinary evidence. It certainly would be extraordinary, but is it necessary? Does Jesus have to appear to every person in the world to make his claims credible? Why would he appear to every person in the world? We don't have to witness every event firsthand in order to believe that the event actually occurred. In fact, it would be physically impossible to witness every event. We believe the testimony of others because they're trustworthy individuals, and especially if their testimony is corroborated by other data. This is exactly the case with the testimony of the New Testament writers. Furthermore, as we pointed out in the 8th chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, if God were too overt because of frequent miraculous displays, then he might, in some cases, infringe on our free will. If the purpose of this life is to allow us to freely make choices that will prepare us for eternity, then God will give us convincing evidence, but not compelling evidence. God will give us convincing evidence, but not compelling evidence of his existence and his purposes. Therefore, those who want to follow God can do so with confidence, and those who do not can suppress or ignore the evidence and live as though he didn't exist. Self-canceling miracles. The great skeptic, David Hume, argued that miracles cannot affirm any one religion because miracles are based on poor testimony and all religions have miracles. In other words, the miracle claims are self-canceling. Unfortunately for David Hume, his objection does not describe the actual state of affairs. First, Hume makes a hasty generalization by saying that alleged miracles from all religions are alike. As we've seen from chapter 9, the miracles associated with Christianity are not based on poor testimony. They are based on early eyewitness, multiple source testimony that is unrivaled in any other world religion. That is, no other world religion has verified miracles like those in the New Testament. Second, Hume's objection is prior to the discoveries of modern science that this is a theistic universe, as we've seen in chapters 3 through 6 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Since this is a theistic universe, Judaism and Islam are the only other major world religions that could possibly be true. Miracles confirming the Old Testament of Judaism also confirm Christianity, so we're left with Islam as the only possible alternative to cancel the miracles of Christianity. But as we saw in the 10th chapter of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, there are no verifiable miracles to confirm Islam. All alleged miracles of Muhammad came long after Muhammad's death and were not based on eyewitness testimony. Finally, the uniqueness, number, and quality of New Testament miracles cannot be explained by anything other than supernatural cause. Jesus performed more than 30 miracles that were instantaneous, always successful, and unique. Some were even predicted. So-called miracle workers who claim partial success affect only psychosomatic cures, engage in trickery, perform satanic signs, or rely on naturally explainable events. In fact, no contemporary healer even claims to be able to heal all diseases, including incurable ones, instantaneously with 100% success. But Jesus and Jesus' apostles did heal with 100% success. This demonstrates the unique God-authenticating nature of the New Testament miracles against all other supernatural claims of any other religion. In short, nothing cancels the miracles of the New Testament. In conclusion, you're going to recount the one solitary life of the risen Lord Jesus Christ. In the beginning of chapter 9, we said that there are two questions we need to answer to see if the New Testament is truly historical. The first question was, do we have accurate copies of the original documents that were written down in the first century? The second question was, do those documents speak the truth? As we've seen in the last 4 chapters, the evidence is strong that the answer to both of those questions is yes. In other words, we can be sure beyond a reasonable doubt that the New Testament is historically reliable. At this point, we're not saying that the New Testament is without error. We'll investigate that question later. Right now, we can only conclude that the major events of the New Testament occurred nearly 2,000 years ago. Jesus really lived, Jesus really taught, Jesus really performed miracles, Jesus really died by crucifixion, and then Jesus really rose from the dead. If you're still not convinced, consider one more piece of corroborating evidence. The incredible impact of Christ's life, as expressed in a short sermon excerpt that is often entitled, One Solitary Life. Here's that sermon excerpt. He was born, speaking of Christ, of course, he was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. That began a quote. The quote continues. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between 2 thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he's the central figure of the human race. I'm well within the mark when I say that all the enemies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. End quote. If there wasn't a resurrection, how could this life be the most influential life of all time? We don't have enough faith to believe that this one solitary life from a remote ancient village could be the most influential life of all time, unless the resurrection is true. Thank you for tuning in to Chapter 12 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Next time we will discuss Chapter 13, where we will answer the question, who is Jesus? Is Jesus God, or is Jesus just another great moral teacher? So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please support my ministry by purchasing my published work, the volume on the 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. Please, as I said, like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.